Welcome to our weekly Pau Hana here at First Unitarian Church of Honolulu. Though we normally meet at 2500 Poly Highway, here we are in a Zoom room. As I've mentioned to folks, if you don't want your image or anything on the recording that we're doing that will be on our YouTube channel, go ahead and change your name or turn off your video. As we do with questions, if you have any questions, feel free to just put them right in the chat box. I'm going to do my best to get through them all. We already have some that were sent to me, and we're going to do that. As everyone knows, Pau Hana is a time where we try not to get too persnickety with all the rules. I'm not muting a bunch of people unless I hear background noise, then I might mute you, and I apologize for that in advance. But we're going to do our best, but you can mute yourself if you so choose, and that's what we're going to do. One quick note, next Tuesday, we'll have a special General Assembly kickoff when Sarah Gibb-Millsbaugh, our new UUA staff liaison person, will be here to answer questions about anything we might have questions about General Assembly or Unitarian Universalism or things like that. And we're really looking forward to it. But I don't want to take any more time away from a very special guest tonight. Judge Levinson is one of my friends and someone I look up to a great deal here in Hawaii. The author of one of our landmark decisions here in the state on marriage equality, and one of a stalwart for access to public information, and to speak with us today about policing and some matters around policing in Honolulu. So first, I want to welcome Stephen and say hello, and ask you how you're doing today.
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Good, good. So one of the reasons I invited you on, we could get into some of the backstory and stuff like that, which I'd love to do, but I think most people know one of the reasons I reached out was your recent decision to step down from the police commission, and I'm hoping you could say a word or two about what led to that decision.
Well, there were really three, broadly speaking, three reasons that I did. Specifically as to the commission, it had simply gotten to the point where I was becoming frustrated with the working of the commission, the politics of the commission, and also to a significant degree the impotence of the commission, notwithstanding that it's generally understood to be a civilian oversight body. It's definitely civilian, but there's very little real oversight power. And there were some other frustrations too internally. And it got to the point where and I think I can speak for Loretta Sheehan, for some of the same reasons and for some different reasons, and fairly simultaneously decided that, at least for now, enough was enough, and so we quit. Maybe sometime in the future I can be back on it, and that might happen or it might not, but I had 4 very, very good years there. And so that was reason number 1. Reason number 2 is personal health. I'm having a bout or a tiff with prostate cancer, as lots and lots of other guys are. But it just happens to be a time when it's really hot and heavy. I'm in the first third of a course of radiation, and that's Monday through Friday. And so that's eating into my schedule. And also we're, Kathy and I are moving from our house in Manoa, where we've been for 19 years, into Kahalanui. So we're getting the house ready to put on the market, and we're lining things up for moving into the unit and making some changes there. And all of that just made my life very busy.
Okay. So I'm gonna just take a look at where some of the noise is coming from. I'm going to do my best, but well, thanks for that. If you don't mind, I don't know if everyone on here on this call knows really what the police commission is. Like if you've watched Batman, you think the police commissioner is in charge of everything that the police do. So I don't think that's quite the case here in Honolulu. Can you say something about the police commission and really the way you understand what it is supposed to be doing here in Honolulu?
Well, that's definitely not the case in Honolulu. Actually, I think in the city of Gotham, the police commissioner was really functionally the police chief. I think the chief in New York City is also called the commissioner. And I think originally Gotham was generally taken to be New York, even though in the Dark Knight it was Chicago. It's all set out in the city charter. The city charter is the constitution for the city and county of Honolulu, just as the state has its constitution and the United States has its constitution. And the commission, as I recall, was created, I think, in 1941. I mean, way back in territorial times, which makes it, as I understand it, the oldest continuously running civilian police commission in the United States. It on paper is quite central to the police department. The chapter in the city charter dealing with the police department begins with a section called organization. So this is what, at its minimum, distilled to the basics, the police department consists of, according to the city charter. There shall be a police department, which shall consist of a chief of police, a police commission, and the necessary staff. I mean, that means the chief of police, the police commission, and whoever else they hire. The chief of police shall be the administrative head of the police department. And the fact that the chief of police shall be the administrative head of the police department is very important. The commission has the power to hire the chief, fire the chief, suspend the chief, discipline the chief, but the commission is expressly prohibited from interfering in any way with the administrative affairs of the department, except for the purposes of making inquiry. So that means that the commission is not like a corporate board. The police commission is not to the chief as the board of Alexander and Baldwin is to the CEO of Alexander and Baldwin. The corporate board is the policy-making body. In the way the charter organizes the police department, the chief is the policy-making entity, and what the commission does in that with respect to policy is purely advisory, and the chief doesn't have to take the commission's advice, assuming that a majority of the commission is on the same wavelength regarding any given policy issue. In fact, the chief can tell us to go fly a kite, but the commission does have the power to fire the chief for any reason, which makes the chief an employee at will in legal terms. But firing a chief and going through the process of searching for and hiring a new one is a long, drawn-out, agonizing process. And the fact that we have that club theoretically hanging over the chief, if we're upset enough, doesn't really get us any policy-making authority, de facto. And as I say, by law, we're prohibited from making policy.
So you bring up a really important question that many of us have, which is about policy. It's a question that people are facing all over this country of new policies that people want to see enacted or old policies that people want to see go away. And were there one or two specific policies regarding perhaps oversight of the police or some other nature that came up that you felt, when you mentioned that third prong of that impotence to do anything, was there something in particular or anything in particular that comes to mind that you would wanted to see enacted and felt you couldn't?
Yes, but it's important to remember that the priorities of a single commissioner or two commissioners out of the 7 don't control. In order for the commission to act as a body, a majority of it has to be in agreement. I think during the 4 years that I was on the commission, the center of gravity in terms of mindset within the commission was more in the direction that the commission's function was to be supportive of the department and the chief and not to be particularly critical. I think the commission has gotten better in spite of that in recent time. At the time the commission had to deal with or decide what to do about Louis Kealoha, the commission had been in the habit of disagreeing with what the chief was doing with respect to anything, as far as I know. I think to this day, the majority of the commissioners see that their role as being a supporter of the department and the chief, and not an active overseer that intervenes with respect to particular policy issues. Having said that, there were some things along the way that I thought were important and that I would have liked for the commission to have more instrumentality regarding. One is the matter of the prerogative of private citizens to carry sidearms either concealed or openly. If this doesn't interest people, just let me know. But I mean, this was something that I thought was a fairly big deal. In 2018, a lawsuit got filed in the federal district court here in Honolulu by a guy living on the Big Island who had applied with the chief of police of the county of Hawaii for a permit to carry a concealed weapon. And there's a particular statute enacted by the legislature that gives the respective chiefs of police a monopoly over the decision whether to grant these applications or deny them. Well, this guy's application had been denied, and he was a member of the National Rifle Association and presumably the Hawaii Rifle Association. And he sued the county of Hawaii and the state of Hawaii for denying him the right to carry a concealed weapon, in his view, in violation of the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. Well, it reached finality at the federal district court level. His lawsuit was basically thrown by the federal district court judge, who ruled that the gun law that controlled the matter of permits to carry concealed weapons did not violate the Second Amendment. And so the guy appealed to the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. It's the largest federal circuit in the United States. It's basically the entire West Coast, including California, Oregon, Washington State, Hawaii, and about 5 other states. And it is the appeals court in the federal organization chart that sits between the trial court and the United States Supreme Court. And so this appeal was heard by a panel of 3 members of the Ninth Circuit, 3 judges of the Ninth Circuit, who were selected at random. And by a 2-to-1 split, the Ninth Circuit held, 1, that Hawaii's gun laws violated the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution and were therefore unconstitutional and void. And 2, that among other core guarantees contained in the Second Amendment, I should add that the reason, the court's basis for striking down our gun laws was that even though the police chiefs had the discretion to grant applications to carry concealed, they never did as to civilians. For the last good number of years, apparently not one single application to carry a concealed weapon had been granted by any of the police chiefs. And so in addition to striking down Hawaii's gun laws, the court also noted that among the core guarantees contained in the Second Amendment, get this, was a fundamental right to carry openly a sidearm, a pistol, like they do in Wyoming and Texas and certain other states. And that lawsuit got put on hold while the United States Supreme Court decided what to do with some others that were pending before it. And the court just recently decided not to take a bunch that as to which further review had been sought. I don't know if the Hawaii case was one of them, but the state law in Hawaii now is, according to the Ninth Circuit, that there is a fundamental right of open carry in the state of Hawaii, and Hawaii's gun laws are unconstitutional because none of the police chiefs were granting any permits, any at all. So that as applied, it was as if there was a blanket prohibition on permits for concealed carry. So as a lawyer and a judge for 20 years and a member of the appeals court of last resort in Hawaii for 17 years, I was very concerned that unless the chief at least was transparent about what the criteria were by which she was passing on these applications and made those criteria generally known to people and continued to deny all applications by non-law enforcement people, not only Hawaii, but the nation as a whole was and is in serious jeopardy of a decision by the United States Supreme Court that strikes down our gun laws and rules that there's a right of open carry under the Second Amendment. So I tried to get some sunshine put on this process, and the chief was quite reluctant to give details. So the way things stand is that her practice and the practice of her fellow chiefs of police may lead to the judicial striking down of our gun control laws and a ruling as to the scope of the Second Amendment that I think would be catastrophic. I mean, I'm a strong gun control advocate and proponent, and it would be fine by me if nobody had the right to carry a concealed weapon or carry a weapon openly. But the problem is that if the chiefs create that environment, the federal courts are very likely to enter a judgment that we're not going to like at all. And there really wasn't anything that I could do about it. Loretta Sheehan had agreed with me on the subject, but nobody else on the commission particularly wanted to talk about it. And so as an attachment to the chief's 2018 first annual evaluation by the commission, I attached a memorandum that I wrote laying that whole issue out and what was concerning me about what the chief was apparently doing and what I feared might happen as a result of that. And Loretta signed on to it too. But most of the rest of the commission generally was of the view that I was out of our lane by pushing on that subject. And so it really went nowhere. That's an example.
So what about, I know you had asked some of us to read the article in Civil Beat about the ability of the commission to, I know one of the things you read in the charter is inquiry, but I'm curious about the ability of the commission to investigate or follow accusations against an officer of force, of unnecessary or potentially deadly force. And so that's something I wanted to ask about as well.
That's a good question, and that is a power that we do have to a point. And this is another illustration of what I'm getting at. In the section in the charter that lists the powers, duties, and functions of the police commission, the following is included. The police commission shall receive, consider, and investigate charges brought by the public against the conduct of any member or members of the police department, and shall submit a written report of its findings to the chief of police. If the chief of police disagrees with the findings of the commission, the chief shall submit the reasons in writing to the police commission for the disagreement. So one of our most time-consuming responsibilities is to receive from members of the public complaints that are lodged against individual police officers or more than one police officer, depending on the circumstances, based on an encounter that they had with that officer or those officers, and which involve, in their view, misconduct on the officer's part, such as failure orally to give name and badge number, discourtesy, conduct unbecoming a police officer, use of excessive force. Those are the most common ones. And when there is such a complaint and it's timely filed, our executive officer then assigns the matter to one of our 3 full-time paid investigators to investigate and work up into a written report with attachments, which can often be that thick. I mean, they're quite exhaustively pursued by the investigators. And at any given meeting, we take these reports that have been completed and therefore are ready for us to pass on up in executive session. Because they involve personnel matters under the Sunshine Law, police officers have a privacy interest in the matter of the fact that there's been a complaint lodged against them, that it generally at that stage outweighs the public's right to look over our shoulder as we discuss it. And we can do one of 4 things with respect to each complaint. We can sustain it, meaning that based on the totality of what we have before us, we believe that the complainant has established the claim that there has been misconduct on the officer's part, and we can therefore sustain the complaint. Or we cannot sustain the complaint, not because we believe the complaint is necessarily phony, but because we decide that the complaining party hasn't proved it sufficiently, hasn't established it by a preponderance of the evidence. Or we can decide that the complaint is unfounded, which usually, when that happens, means that the investigation shows that the police officer against whom the complaint is made wasn't even there, that the complainant is the wrong person. So therefore, the complaint is unfounded. Or we can decide that that the officer is exonerated, meaning, yes, the officer did what the complainant says the officer did, but it didn't rise to the level of misconduct. We have sustained many, 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 many complaints by members of the public against police officers. We do not have the authority, though, to prescribe, to decide what consequences there will be as a result of the sustained complaint. So what the charter requires us to do is submit our conclusions to the chief in writing. The chief will take them under, and they're purely advisory. The chief will then take that under advisement, and together with her command staff will review the complaint and will either agree with us or disagree with us. If we sustain a complaint and the chief disagrees and comes to the conclusion that she doesn't believe that the available evidence is sufficient to sustain the complaint, she can and does overrule us. If she agrees with us that there has been misconduct, she has a monopoly over what the consequences are by way of discipline. And that discipline can range from anything as Manini as a notation in the officer's record of misconduct, or a written reprimand, which becomes part of the officer's employment history, up to 5 days suspension, 30 days suspension, termination, firing. And our police chief has terminated a number of officers for some very egregious misconduct. But under the collective bargaining agreement between the police union, SHOPO, and the police department and the city and county, police officers have a right to file a grievance in the event that they believe that they are being disciplined for unwarranted reasons. And under the collective bargaining agreement, that dispute then goes to binding arbitration from which there is no appeal, so that the arbitrator's decision becomes final. So in a fairly recent and high profile and egregious case in which the police chief fired the police officer involved, this is a guy you may recall on more instances than one, beat the tar out of his wife. Went to arbitration. The arbitrator vacated the chief's termination of the officer and instead decided that 5 days suspension was the appropriate discipline. And that was the end of it, because by collective bargaining agreement, the arbitrator's decision was final.
So there's a question in the chat box about how to make a complaint. I don't want to get into too much of the practical stuff with someone at your level. We can do that. But
that's actually a good question and an important one, and I can answer it very quickly. You call the police commission or go down to the police commission office, which is in a Leahy Place. You enter from the Richard Street side, and you tell the executive officer that you want to make a complaint. There's a form to do it with. You sign it, you have it notarized, and it's referred to one of our investigators. It's really that easy, but you have to do it within 90 days of the occurrence of whatever it is you're complaining about. I'm sorry, 60 days, I think it is.
60.
Within whatever it is you're complaining about.
So this leads to another question about what we're hearing a lot about from someone with a bully pulpit, but also from a lot of this kind of old school thinking, which is, there's just a few bad apples who are causing this whole thing. And then there's a lot of voices who are saying, no, this is systematic and systemic, is the way that police can behave with virtually more or less very hard barriers to overcome for some kind of discipline. Can you say something about this? It's just a few bad apples versus whether there is something systemic going on in the foundation of those who are policing citizens in the United States. And maybe you want to just talk about Honolulu, but yeah.
Well, yeah, that's what I know. So
I'm trying here.
I read, I stay abreast of the news, I assume, like everyone else does. And I'm very interested in it, and when I was early on in my private practice, the firm I was with did a lot of police brutality litigation for people complaining. And I did a fair bit of criminal defense work also, and therefore interacted with police officers a fair bit. And over the course of the 20 years I was a judge, 3 years trying significant high-profile felonies, including 15 consecutive homicide prosecutions, and also 17 years on the Supreme Court, writing a whole lot of decisions that had to do with proper and improper and constitutional and unconstitutional police conduct. I know something at least about Hawaii. I can tell you that when I began private practice back in 1972, and we were doing a lot of police brutality cases, it seemed to me that the typical Honolulu police officer was a thug. I mean that literally. Not particularly well educated and not particularly disciplined, and essentially free to do what he damn well pleased. Over the course of the 48 years since then, there has been a lot of change. during the 3 years when I was presiding over criminal trials, and therefore listened to a lot of police witnesses at trial, it was almost as if I was living in a different city from what I remembered from my days as a kid doing police brutality. The typical police officer was highly educated, very articulate, in my judgment, honest and forthcoming, which was something that I felt very good about. And I believe that that is a fair description of most police officers in the department, with exceptions. I mean, there are some bad people in the department who shouldn't be there. And that, I suspect, ever more shall be so, which doesn't mean that one doesn't try to do something about it. But you take a population of roughly 2,000 plus in any organization, and you're going to find some people who should be looking for another line of work and shouldn't be there. But there are some systemic problems too, in my opinion. The issue of what constitutes the reasonable use of extreme force and deadly force is a tough one. And I don't think the department's mindset on that subject, certainly Shopo's mindset on that subject, is not the same as mine. With respect to the use of deadly force, the standard that the police department follows internally essentially is, given the circumstances and the degree of force that the officer used, under the circumstances, was it reasonable for that officer to believe that he or she was at substantial risk of serious bodily injury or death? And that gets pretty subjective.
Yeah.
That's not the way courts look at it. So there's some disconnect there. And I mean, I went through the Citizens Police Academy, which I recommend to everybody who's interested. It's a fascinating experience. I did it when I first joined the commission, and we spent 2 days at the police academy in a kind of mini course, and they did a demonstration for us as to how quickly and under what kind of very trying circumstances police officers have to make instantaneous snap judgments as to whether to draw their weapon and use it or not. And that, I mean, when you actually witness it, that makes the whole thing somewhat more complicated than you thought it was before. But I do think the matter of the use of force is something that the police commissions and the legislature and the chief and the command staff should all be taking ongoing looks at and constantly tweaking. The whole matter of the extent to which officers should be trained in de-escalation techniques is another important issue. How do you lower the temperature out in the field of a situation that can very quickly get out of hand? And that requires real skill. Our chief is a great fan and proponent of the use of de-escalation techniques. I'm not sure that the officers in the first instance are trained as thoroughly as they could be on the subject, and I'm not sure that they get ongoing retraining on the subject as often and in as great detail as I would like, as I think they ought to be.
Could I ask
Yeah, go, sure.
Yeah, I was going to say, just before we move off that a little bit, one of the areas that kind of comes up for us as a congregation that we look at, and also many others, is the sort of what you might see in either Anna DuVernay's 13th or maybe Michelle Alexander's work that says whatever discretion is in the hands of the police or in the prosecutor is a bit laid bare when you look at the results of who's actually incarcerated. And so one of the questions I think many people have is when 40% of the people incarcerated are of Hawaiian ancestry, there's some question about what other kind of systemic things are happening here and whether there is a systemic issue of racism going on in the policing of the people in Hawaii.
That's not as easy. It's a more complex question in Honolulu and in Hawaii generally, I think, than it is nationally. And when you consider the demographics of the state and of the city and county of Honolulu, I mean, one, the Black population of Honolulu is relatively small. It's increasing in size and proportion over time, but Black folks are still a very, very, very small minority of the population. Add to that the fact that there is no ethnic majority in Hawaii. Hawaii is multi-ethnic, and the department is multi-ethnic. I think the ethnicity of the Honolulu Police Department more or less mirrors the general population. So it's difficult to conclude, and I haven't concluded, that there is systemic racism in the Honolulu Police Department, because you have to ask, racism as directed at whom? Now, there's a significant difference between overt, conscious racism on the one hand and implicit bias on the other. And I'm assuming that most people who are involved in this conversation right now have some sense of what implicit bias is. And it turns out that everybody, and I mean everybody, including me and TJ and everyone else on this call, have implicit biases. We either recognize some or all, or we don't, but we have them. And there are a lot of complicated reasons why we have them, but they all have to do one way or another with our learning history. And implicit bias, I think, can affect the judgment of individual police officers. It's not a coincidence that the percentage of people who self-identify as Native Hawaiian is and who are arrested is disproportionate to their numbers or proportion in the population. Why is that? Not sure. It's possible that there's some implicit bias involved. There are also a lot of members of the Honolulu Police Department who are Native Hawaiians. The decision as to who is incarcerated is a different question, though, from who is investigated and who is arrested. In the first instance, when a person is arrested for an offense that is at all serious, the practice is for bail to be set, and bail is set by the police until the person can be brought before a judge, generally within 2 or 3 days, and the judge then resets bail. If you read the statutes that the Hawaii legislature has passed governing bail, you will see that there is one reason and one reason only for setting bail, and that is to ensure the presence of the defendant at trial. It's not to keep a dangerous person off the street, because when a person is arrested for a criminal offense, we have a presumption of innocence, which means that that person is innocent and remains innocent unless proved guilty at trial or by plea beyond a reasonable doubt as to every element of the offense. And so even though the police do it all the time when they set bail in the first instance, and even though the courts routinely do it, set bail in an escalating amount as a function of the seriousness of the charged offense, I am telling you that that's illegal. That's unconstitutional.
And you're bringing us to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I just want to add one more thing to that.
Sure.
The proper remedy when a judge is faced with a defendant who available information demonstrates poses a serious risk to public safety or is a flight risk that no amount of bail could insure against if the person is allowed to go free, or is extremely likely to tamper with or intimidate witnesses, then what the Hawaii law entitles a court to do is to deny bail altogether. But setting bail at an amount that you know the defendant can't pay, and therefore the defendant has to sit in jail until the defendant goes to trial and there's finality and the defendant's either convicted or acquitted, is one of the systemic reasons why we have an overcrowding problem and all sorts of other problems. And it's also grossly unjust in my opinion. But it's going to take a decision from the Hawaii Supreme Court or a change in the laws by the legislature to get somebody to do something about it. I've been imploring the Office of the Public Defender for years to take up to the Supreme Court on a writ of habeas corpus, which can get you to the Supreme Court very quickly, a matter of a defendant client an amount of bail that the client can't pay, and that's a violation of the right of availability of bail, which is guaranteed by the United States Constitution and the Hawaii Constitution. But for reasons that I don't understand, nobody's ever done it.
So bringing up the Office of the Public Defender, there's another official in the mix here that I think people have some questions about, and that's the city prosecutor. And I think we have a question about, have you endorsed someone in that race, and who and why?
Well, yes, I have. And in fact, the formal announcement of the endorsement got e-blasted today. I've gotten to know Jackie Esser over the last year plus. We happened to get thrown together with a class at the Waldorf School in advance of an oral argument that the Supreme Court was about to hold in a criminal case in which was going to be held in the auditorium one of the public high schools, and which students from a number of public high schools, or to which the students from a number of public high schools were invited. And so part of that process was to send lawyers out into the classrooms to prepare them for that, that oral argument. And Jackie and I happened to get thrown together in a small group of lawyers in that particular class. And so I've followed her ever since, and was very excited to learn that she had decided to run for prosecuting attorney. She is extremely reform-minded. She's very smart. She spent her entire career in the criminal justice system, and I think she'd make a great prosecuting attorney. I also have tremendous respect for Steve Alm, who I've known since he was a deputy prosecuting attorney in my court back in 99 or 90, not to mention later the U.S. attorney for the District of Hawaii, much less a circuit court trial judge. So, I mean, he's terrific too, but I'm backing it, Jackie, because if Jackie is elected, I think we will see the most progressive changes within the prosecutor's office that we'd see among any of the candidates who are running.
So speaking of change, I know what my folks like to know about is, sort of, I think this is kind of a two-part question. The first one is, how much change is possible, do you believe, through the police commission? Is there anything that can be done through the commission that you believe, that the way it works now, that you believe could actually make powerful systemic change?
Well, in theory, the police commission could lobby. I mean, it could lobby the city council, it could lobby the state legislature. If it chose to, which would require the agreement of 4 commissioners, that doing that was something that they wanted, they wanted the commission to do. And how much clout the commission would have as a lobbying entity, I really don't know, because the commission historically hasn't done very much lobbying, if any. So I suspect that if it were relevant to lobby the city council, if county ordinances were involved, the council would listen carefully. And I suspect that if the legislature were the body that the commission was lobbying, depending, the commission might flick the commission off or listen to it carefully. The way it deals with people who provide input to it on the merits of policy questions that are pending before it by way of pending legislation do already. I think if one wanted to give the commission real teeth with respect to making policy that would govern and bind the police department, the charter would have to be amended to give the commission policy-making authority. Because right now, as I say, it not only doesn't give the commission policy-making power, but it prohibits the commission from making policy and sticking its nose in too much in the day-to-day administrative operation of the department. But as I understand it, out in the great big island of America, there are police commissions that do have policy-making authority, and there are commissions that don't, like we don't. If we had it, then we could tell the chief on particular subjects what she had to do. or what policies she had to establish. Now, our only club is to say, if you don't do X, we'll fire you. And that's never happened. The commission has never done that. And it's also a pretty cumbersome way to be a policy-making entity. In fact, it's a pretty stupid way of being a policy-making entity.
Yeah, only to have the final authority does nothing for like intermediate or relative authority in the meantime. Yeah, it's just.
Yeah, what's going to take is an amendment to the city charter. Every 10 years, there's a charter commission that is convened that combs the whole thing from beginning to end on every subject and puts together a list of proposed revisions, which then go to the electorate in November of that election year for ratification or rejection. And I think there may be some other ways of getting proposed amendments to the city charter on the ballot. But that's what would have to happen. And the amendment have expressly to confer on the police commission the power to, how does it put it with respect to what the police chief has the power to do, promulgate rules and regulations necessary for the organization and internal administration of the department. The police chief has a monopoly over that. If the commission was given that power, then the commission could do what the chief does now. But I think only then.
Yeah. So the questions I know some people are going to have are, well, what is, other than lobbying to change the charter, is attending the hearings, does that matter, of the police commission, and speaking up to them, or does like making some kind of change in the folks who actually sit on the commission? Or, I mean, I think the mayor just picks people, right? There's no like special way to do that, right? I mean, the mayor just picked the replacements for you, correct?
Yes, the mayor appoints the members of all city and county boards and commissions, right, subject to confirmation by the city council. And in my case, back in October, I think, of 2016, when people were tearing their hair out over the Louis K. Aloha situation, and the supposedly stolen mailbox, and the lawsuit that had been filed, the civil lawsuit that had been filed against him, I just got a phone call out of the blue from the mayor's office with the message that the mayor wanted to talk to me about the police commission. I've known Kirk Caldwell for a long time because he was my state representative. Being a Manoa resident, he was my state representative. And I think way back, I knew him as a private practitioner some. And so I thought, well, Kirk knows me. Maybe he wants to kick some thoughts he has around about the commission and what's going on. I wasn't particularly plugged in the subject, so imagine my surprise when it turned out that he was asking me if I was willing to go on to the commission. And so I asked myself, why not? And I couldn't think of a reason why not. So I said, sure. It was a very, very, very stimulating experience. Who's on the commission makes a big difference. Big difference. And the mayor has just announced the appointments of Loretta's and my replacements, Mike Broderick and Doug Chin. I've known Mike Broderick since he became Chief Justice Moon's administrative director of the courts way back. So I've known him for a very long time. He became a family court judge and then been the president and CEO of the Honolulu Y for years and years and years and years. He's one of the smartest people I know, and he is going to be fantastic. And I'm very optimistic about how Doug Chin will do on the commission also, with his background in law enforcement. So I think Doug and Mike's being on the commission is going to make a real difference. It's critical that there be a majority of commissioners who, I mean, if one is interested in being proactive, and if one is interested in the commission having real oversight, influence, and hopefully power, you want people on the commission who are ready, willing, and able to exercise that power if they have it, and use the bully pulpit persuasively if they don't have the power to by fiat, to decree policy. And I don't think we've yet had a commission in which there has been a majority that is activist in that respect yet, but we could. And probably the sooner the better.
So we're at an hour, and I know there's I do try to keep it to an hour and respect people's time where we're there. I have a few other questions, and I feel like you had something else you wanted to say. So if people want to hang in for a little bit, we'll do a little bit of a bonus round if you have the time, Judge.
I do.
Okay.
And as usual, the hour subjectively to me felt like 15 minutes.
Sure.
It takes me 15 minutes to state my name.
I wasn't going to say that, but I hear you. So one question, do you have another thought? I think I might have interrupted you at the end of discussing
No.
that. Okay.
Go ahead.
Then one question that someone else had was, does attending the Honolulu Police Commission meetings matter, or does like lobbying commissioners matter? Is there something that an individual, say on this call, could be doing to start moving more toward an activist commission?
The public is free to attend commission meetings with the asterisk that at the moment it happens to be by telephone, because that's because of the pandemic and the lockdown and restrictions that have been put in place on access to the main station of the police department because of COVID-19. but anyone can attend a meeting who wants to, and anyone who wants to can submit testimony. Technically, it's supposed to be regarding a matter that's on the agenda for that meeting, but historically, people have appeared to talk about whatever they want to, and generally that's been permitted. They have limited time to do it. If you happen to know a member of the commission there's nothing that prevents you or the commissioner from talking to one another. And commissioners welcome input and feedback from anyone who's interested. And commissioners can be influenced by that in a good way. So I'd urge that if anybody knows people on the commission and there's something that you feel strongly about that you want to get on the table, you can both talk to them and you can appear at a meeting and testify.
I believe there's still a 7th seat vacant, is that right?
That's right.
Do you have any thoughts on who should be there, or do you want to handicap it for us?
No,
Okay.
I don't. I was praying for Mike Broderick for a lot of reasons, some of which I can't discuss. And that prayer was answered. And I think Doug Chin is going to be very good. And so I think we need somebody else like them. Okay.
A few other kind of questions that made it into the chat. One person had a question, and I don't want to get too far into the Fifth Amendment kind of issues here, but the question was, what is the standard for shooting someone while fleeing? my understanding is that in all jurisdictions, one may not shoot someone in retreat, but what is the standard?
And the short answer to that is you're quite right.
Right, okay. There you go.
Just a very quick war story. In my professional childhood, we represented a burglar who was shot in the back in the spine while fleeing arrest or an attempt at arrest, and was rendered a quadriplegic. And our case really was organized around the fact that the police were not and are not permitted to use deadly force to prevent an escape. And I'm not talking about an escape from prison. The law on that may be a little bit different. But we had a jury waived trial, and we got a judgment of close to $500,000 against the city and county because of that police misconduct, even though the plaintiff was a career burglar. Mm-hmm. His career came to a rapid end.
A career escaper. Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, the short answer to that is a misuse of deadly force, and it's actionable.
Yeah. We had another question. How does the police department address ICE detainees? I have my own experience with this, working with some migration matters. I know that sometimes people are scooped up as they are exiting OCCC. They're tipped off by folks about the departure from one term and are picked up by ICE. So I know that in some cases there's some discussion, but is there an official, or are you aware of a police department policy regarding potential detainees?
My understanding of the policy under Chief Ballard's regime is that the department does not go out of its way to cooperate with or act in concert with ICE. So that if ICE becomes aware that someone is in detention by the police, there's no way of preventing ICE from scooping that person up as they leave. But it's my understanding that the department doesn't tip ICE off and does not do anything overtly to cooperate with ICE.
Okay.
Yeah, we're not a sanctuary city in that sense, but the department does not regard itself as legally or morally obligated to do anything more in concert with ICE than the law requires, and that's federal law, right, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm. And then one last question that someone brought in, and then we'll kind of wrap it here, but it was sort of a functional one of, are folks appointed to the commission for an undetermined period of time, or is there like a period of appointment, or how does that all work to the commission?
They're appointed for a 5-year term, and if at the end of their term they're not reappointed, but nobody else is appointed to replace them, they can hold over until somebody else is appointed to replace them. So I was appointed to replace a guy named Ron Takeda, who is, I think still is the chief administrator of the Carpenters Union, and he was also the chair of the police commission that year, and had been for a few years. And he had held over for a year. And so that ate into my 5-year term by 1 year. And so I was appointed for 4 years. That 4-year term would have expired this coming December, which would have left the mayor time to reappoint me if he'd wanted to for another 5 years. But as it happened, I left. And I don't know whether he would have reappointed me or not.
Good. Well, I want to thank you so much for your time. If I could just ask one, we didn't get into much of like I know that you love movies, and you kind of hinted at it knowing as much as you do about The Dark Knight. you know, if you, I know it's one of the things we ask, and I want to embrace you in our community that we often ask in our coffee hour is, what are you streaming, and or what have you watched lately you think other people should be watching? Since I know there's plenty of things to be doing, but sometimes it helps to have a moment and to share in something someone we respect and admire has been watching, streaming or watching. Is there something you think, based on what we've all talked about, we should watch right tonight?
I have a confession to make.
Please.
We're you know, being of the age that Kathy and I are, and therefore somewhat technologically challenged, we don't stream.
Wow.
I have a feeling that once we get into Kahala Nui and buy a new TV and all of that, we'll start streaming. So what, and we are movie freaks. And so this has been like a cold turkey big time. But what we are doing, we got a huge DVD collection, including, you know, HBO series and that sort of thing. So we're watching a lot of movies. And so we recently did, for the first time, Better Call Saul in its entirety, at least the first 4 seasons, which is the prequel to Breaking Bad, and is just as good as Breaking Bad. So if there's anyone who liked Breaking Bad and liked the Saul Goodman character played by Bob Odenkirk, you will love Better Call Saul. It's how he came to be what he was when he first encountered Walter White. And then having done that, we went back to Breaking Bad and watched that from beginning to end. And we are now revisiting Foyle's War, which is a British series that was done back in the early 2000s that takes place outside of London in a provincial small town on the southern coast, and is a murder mystery in form. But what it actually does is show you what it was like to be in England from before the Blitz began in 1940 through the end of the war. And it's absolutely fantastic. And last night, speaking of the Dark Knight, and Heath Ledger, who I absolutely revere, we hauled out Brokeback Mountain the other night. Watched that again.
Yeah, one of the greats. Yeah.
And last night, Kathy went to bed, so I watched Monsters Ball, which got Halle Berry an Oscar back in 2002, and in which Billy Bob Thornton is absolutely fantastic, and Heath Ledger was pretty damn good, and it's a great movie. I just ordered Emma, the most recent Emma, from Amazon, and it arrived today. So that's, I think, the next movie we're going to see.
I'll add to all of those things.
It's really good.
The shout out to Michael McKean's performance in Better Call Saul as the brother is just.
Michael McKean is fantastic.
Phenomenal.
And when you consider that, you think of him in terms of the Christopher Guest movies, Best in Show, and all of that. I mean, the dramatic acting he does in Better Call Saul is just out of this world. Yes.
So this is what Steve and I normally talk about. I'm sorry, this is what Judge Levinson and I normally talk about when we get together. So it's good to do this. So I want to say thank you for bringing so much wisdom, so much care, so much concern and love to us here tonight. I know we all appreciated you touching on so many subjects so well, and also giving us some things to maybe take with us to think about and also watch. So thanks so much. And we hope to talk with you again soon.
Well, thank you. I'd love to do it. And thanks to everybody for participating.
Yeah, I'm going to end our little recording here.